You're sitting in the dust. It's roughly 300,000 years ago. The sun is harsh, the wind is dry, and the landscape is completely indifferent to you. There is no modern medicine, there is no therapy, there is no concept of a mental health day. There is just the vast, unforgiving African savanna and a group of primates trying not to die. Then, one of your companions experiences a sudden intense shock. Maybe a severe physical trauma, maybe the loss of a child, maybe a moment of overwhelming, exhausting relief after surviving a predator attack. And then something happens that makes absolutely no survival sense. Water begins to leak from their eyes. It spills over their lower eyelids, runs down their cheeks, and drips into the dust. Nobody taught them to do this. There was no cultural expectation that sadness required moisture. There was just a surge of internal emotion and a physical response that essentially blinded them in an environment where not being able to see usually meant you were about to be eaten.
Here's the thing. Blurring your vision when you are in distress is a terrible biological strategy. It doesn't make you fight better, it doesn't help you run faster, it wastes precious water and salt in an arid climate. By any obvious evolutionary metric, disabling your own primary sensory input when you are already vulnerable is a fatal design flaw. And yet, we all do it. Human beings are the only species on the planet that shed tears in response to emotional distress. Every other animal on Earth cries out vocally. Only we leak water. So when did this start? Why does it exist at all? And what evolutionary problem was so pressing that natural selection decided the best solution was to literally blind us with our own fluids? This is the story of how human beings learned to cry, and it was never really about the water.
Before we look at humans, we need to look at everything else. Specifically, we need to understand what tears are actually for, because evolution did not invent the tear duct for heartbreak. Every land-dwelling vertebrate produces tears. If you have eyes that are exposed to the air, you need a mechanism to keep them from drying out. These are called basal tears, and your body is producing them right now. They are a constant, invisible wash of moisture, mucus, and oils that lubricate the cornea every time you blink. Then there are reflex tears. If a piece of dust blows into your eye, or if you slice a raw onion, your lacrimal glands flood the surface with a sudden burst of fluid to flush the irritant out. When you see a dog with weepy eyes, or when people talk about crocodile tears, this is what is happening. The animal is not grieving. It is just performing routine optical maintenance. The tear is purely mechanical. For hundreds of millions of years, that was the entire story. Tears were windshield wiper fluid, nothing more.
But somewhere in the evolutionary lineage of Homo sapiens, a strange neurological short circuit occurred. The lacrimal gland, the biological machinery responsible for flushing out physical debris, became wired to the limbic system, the part of the brain responsible for processing emotion. Suddenly, the system wasn't just responding to physical irritants on the outside, it began responding to emotional irritants on the inside. Charles Darwin, who figured out almost everything else about human evolution, was completely baffled by this. In his 1872 book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, Darwin concluded that emotional tears were just an incidental result, as purposeless as the secretion of tears from a blow outside the eye. He thought it was a biological accident, a glitch in the plumbing. But Darwin was wrong. Natural selection does not maintain expensive, highly visible, physically disabling behaviors for hundreds of thousands of years by accident. If emotional crying served no purpose, the humans who didn't blind themselves during a crisis would have consistently outsurvived the ones who did. The trait would have vanished. Instead, it became universal. Every human culture on Earth cries, which means this bizarre neurological glitch wasn't an accident. It was an upgrade.
If you want to understand what a physiological system is doing, the best place to start is by looking at what it's made of. In the 1980s, a biochemist named William H. Frey II decided to do an experiment that sounds like a mild form of psychological torture. He brought subjects into a lab and had them chop onions to harvest their reflex tears. Then he sat them down, made them watch incredibly sad movies, and harvested their emotional tears. When he put the two types of tears under a microscope and analyzed their chemical composition, he found something that fundamentally changed how we understand crying. Reflex tears, the onion tears, were mostly just water, designed to wash and rinse. But the emotional tears were entirely different. They were thick with proteins.
Specifically, they contained unusually high levels of adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. This is a peptide hormone that your body produces in massive quantities when you are under severe stress. Frey also found high levels of prolactin, a hormone associated with emotional regulation and bonding. And perhaps most importantly, he found leucine and enkephalin, an endogenous opioid, a natural painkiller. This wasn't just salt water, it was a highly concentrated chemical cocktail. Frey's hypothesis was revolutionary. Emotional crying is an excretory process. Just as we exhale carbon dioxide to clear our lungs or sweat to cool our skin, we cry to flush excess stress hormones out of our neurochemical system. When you experience overwhelming emotion, whether it is grief, terror, or extreme joy, your brain floods with chemicals. If those chemicals stay in your system at peak levels, they cause severe physiological damage.
Crying, under this theory, is the body's emergency release valve. It physically removes the biochemistry of stress from your body. The leucine and enkephalin acts as a localized anesthetic, which is why people often report feeling a deep, physical sense of relief, a catharsis, after a heavy bout of crying, even if the situation that caused the crying hasn't changed at all. The problem is still there, but the chemical panic has been drained out through your face. But there is a catch. The chemical purge theory explains why crying feels good, but it doesn't explain the mechanics. If the only goal was to excrete stress hormones, evolution could have routed those chemicals through our sweat or our urine or our breath. Why route it through the eyes? Why make the release valve so incredibly visible? Why design a distress signal that smears your face and alters your appearance? Because crying was never meant to be a private event.
Think about human infants. If you compare a newborn human to a newborn chimpanzee or a newborn horse, the human is almost comically helpless. A foal can stand and run within hours of being born. A baby monkey can physically cling to its mother's fur while she moves through the canopy. Human infants cannot do any of this. They are born neurologically unfinished. We are an extraordinarily altricial species, meaning our young require massive, sustained, intensive care just to survive the first year of life. When an infant needs something, food, warmth, protection, it vocalizes, it wails. Acoustic crying is highly effective. It cuts through background noise, it immediately triggers distress centers in the adult brain, and it demands action. But acoustic crying has a massive biological downside. It is essentially a homing beacon for predators. If you are a group of early humans hiding from a saber-toothed cat in the brush, a wailing infant is a death sentence.
Enter the tear. Emotional tears are an acoustic signal translated into a visual one. They are a way to scream for help, silently. Notice the physical properties of an emotional tear compared to a reflex tear. Because of that high protein content Frey discovered, emotional tears are more viscous. They are thicker. They don't just flash evaporate or drip straight off the eyelashes. They cling to the skin. They track slowly down the cheeks. They catch the light. They are biologically engineered to be seen. When you look at someone whose eyes are brimming with tears, their entire facial geometry changes. The eyebrows pull up and together. The lips pull down. The cheeks flush. It is a highly specific, universally recognized visual flag that says, my defenses are completely down. I am overwhelmed. I cannot help myself. In a brutal environment, signaling that you are defenseless should get you killed. But in the strange, hypersocial world of early human evolution, it did the exact opposite. It saved us.
Let's go back to the savannah. You are sitting in the dust, completely overwhelmed, and your face is wet. You aren't making a sound, so the predators don't know you are vulnerable. But the members of your group, the people sitting 3 feet away from you, can see it clearly. This is where the biology of crying stops being about the individual and starts being about the network. When you see another human being cry, especially when the tears are genuine and emotionally driven, your brain does not remain neutral. Almost immediately, your mirror neurons begin to fire. These are the specialized cells that allow you to internally simulate what someone else is experiencing. Witnessing tears triggers a sharp spike in oxytocin in the observer's brain. Oxytocin is often called the bonding hormone or the cuddle chemical. It is the exact same neurochemical that floods a mother's system when she nurses her child, or that releases when you hold hands with someone you love.
By simply looking at a tear tracking down your cheek, my brain is chemically forced into a state of deep protective empathy. This is an evolutionary superpower. In a hostile environment, a group of hominids that could instantly trigger mutual care and protection without having to speak had a massive survival advantage. If a group member was injured, grieving, or psychologically broken, they didn't have to burn precious energy trying to explain their condition. The tears did the heavy lifting. They functioned as a biological override switch, shutting down aggression in the surrounding group members and replacing it with an overwhelming drive to nurture and protect. Think about how difficult it is to remain angry at someone who starts genuinely crying. The tears literally disarm us. They signal complete surrender. In the brutal mathematics of early human survival, showing weakness usually meant you were discarded, but emotional crying flipped that equation. It made vulnerability the very thing that guaranteed you would not be left behind. It turned individual pain into a shared physical response. We survived because our bodies learned how to hack the empathy centers of the people around us.
But this brings us to a massive, glaring contradiction. If crying is an emergency distress signal designed to purge stress chemicals and beg for protection, why do we cry when we are happy? Why do people sob at weddings? Why do athletes weep when they win a championship? Why does listening to an incredibly beautiful piece of music cause your vision to blur and your eyes to spill over? There is no predator, there is no grief, there is no need for a protective huddle. To understand this, we have to realize that the human nervous system is incredibly sophisticated, but it is also surprisingly blunt. Your autonomic nervous system has two main branches. The sympathetic nervous system is your gas pedal. It drives the fight or flight response, pumping you full of adrenaline and cortisol when you are under threat. The parasympathetic nervous system is your brakes. It drives the rest and digest functions, calming you down and bringing your body back to baseline.
When you experience an extreme, overwhelming emotion, even a positive one like profound joy or intense relief, your sympathetic nervous system hits the gas hard. Your heart rate spikes, your breathing becomes shallow, your brain floods with neurotransmitters. The sheer intensity of the neurological load is staggering. To your central nervous system, extreme joy feels dangerously similar to a panic attack. The system is redlining. It is overheating. Crying is how the brain hits the brakes. Tears of joy are a parasympathetic rescue operation. When the neurological load gets too high, regardless of whether the source of that load is a tragic loss or an Olympic gold medal, the brain triggers the lacrimal glands. The physical act of weeping forces the parasympathetic nervous system to take over. It lowers the heart rate. It cools the system down. We don't cry because we are sad. We cry because we are full. We cry because the emotional capacity of the human brain has exceeded the physical capacity of the human body, and the energy has to go somewhere. The water spilling out of our eyes is just the exhaust from a system that is running hotter than any other biological machine on the planet.
Here is the tragedy of the modern tear. We took a biological masterpiece and turned it into a social failure. For the vast majority of our history, crying was an accepted, expected, and vital part of human interaction. If you look at the oldest pieces of recorded literature, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to Homer's Iliad, the greatest warriors and kings wept constantly. They cried in front of their armies. They cried in their tents. There was no shame attached to the physical expression of overwhelming emotion. It was simply what bodies did. But as societies became more industrialized and as stoicism became conflated with strength, we began to train ourselves out of it. We decided that suppressing a biological reflex was a sign of discipline. We taught our children, especially our boys, that leaking water from their eyes was a sign of weakness, a failure of character, a breach of composure. By doing this, we didn't stop the emotion. We just broke the release valve.
When you fight back tears, when you swallow that lump in your throat and force your eyes to stay dry, you are actively blocking your body from excreting toxic levels of stress hormones. You are keeping the cortisol trapped in your bloodstream. You are preventing the release of leucine and kephalin, denying yourself the natural painkiller that your brain is desperately trying to administer. You are keeping the sympathetic nervous system redlined, refusing to let the brakes engage. And socially, you are blinding your community. By refusing to cry, you are deliberately withholding the visual signal that triggers empathy and connection in the people around you. You are choosing to suffer in a way that is invisible, which means you are choosing to suffer alone. We have spent the last few centuries trying to unwire a survival mechanism that took evolution millions of years to perfect. We traded neurochemical health for the appearance of control.
We treat crying like it is a breakdown of the system. We apologize for it, we wipe our faces quickly, look down at the floor and say, "I'm sorry, I just need a minute." We treat it like a temporary malfunction that needs to be hidden away until we can fix ourselves and return to normal. But the science is clear, and it points in the exact opposite direction. Crying is not a breakdown. It is the repair mechanism running in real time. It is one of the most metabolically expensive, neurologically complex, and socially profound behaviors our species has ever produced. It is the physical manifestation of trust. It is the body refusing to be poisoned by its own stress. And it is the mind reaching out to the tribe and demanding to be seen.
Which brings us back to the dust and the savanna and the heat. 300,000 years ago, our ancestors figured out something that no other animal on Earth ever did. They realized you don't always have to fight, and you don't always have to run. Sometimes the most powerful survival tool is to stand completely still, let your defenses drop entirely, and let the water fall. This wasn't weakness, it was a signal, a profound display of vulnerability that triggered empathy and strengthened social bonds. Archaeological records confirm this deep history of care. We find remains of early humans who survived for years with debilitating injuries only because their group provided for them. They survived because they let themselves be broken in front of each other, fostering a level of trust that became its own form of armor. We still don't fully understand the depths of why that works. We just know it does.